This is a video on Kant's Grounding and Metaphysics of Morals, Section 2 for our Philosophy 2310 Theory of Ethics class. We've already seen the stress of Kant on intention in Section 1, and this is going to be explained further, as well as other more complex notions. Recall that I said to you that one of the best ways to conceive of Kant's account of ethics here in the Grounding of the Metaphysics of Morals is, as it were, an onion. We saw with regard to Section 1 that there were some obvious things that were fairly clear to us with regard to the notion of morality, and namely the idea of the goodwill. We just analyzed that and found that, in fact, one must have a good will in order to be sure to always will properly and always have the right intentions in our actions. And so we saw there also that for Kant, the moral value of any action lies primarily in its intention, if not solely in its intention, and not in the outcome. So this is not a kind of consequentialist metaphysics or of morals or theory of ethics. That is something concentrated on the outcomes, not at all. But rather for Kant, what is most important is the intention formed in the mind of human beings. Let me add this, though. In forming the proper intentions, we are also required, according to Kant, to make good use of our minds. And so there's a moral obligation that we think carefully. For example, it would be altogether inappropriate for you to forget your mother's birthday or forget Mother's Day. And we would say that that's a moral failing. But you could say, well, I didn't have a calendar handy, or I didn't pay attention, but I had no intention of missing Mother's Day. Not good enough. You are required, out of respect for yourself and others, to make use of your reasoning. And so that's an obligation and a matter of respect. So when Kant talks about intention, he's not just talking about feeling good towards something or wishing or wanting or something of that sort, but rather intention includes using your mind to keep track of reality around you and to form the proper intentions and to carry out your obligations, such as remembering Mother's Day or other holidays for family. So here in the second section, Kant is concerned with further distinctions, and we'll see these in some detail. I want to begin, though, by distinguishing four terms and then also a fifth term as well. The fifth term, synthetic a priori practical proposition, describes the categorical imperative. And I would say that roughly 20 to 25% of what you need to know about Kant is found in that notion of a synthetic a priori practical proposition. So I want to spend a considerable amount of time explaining that. Let me begin with a priori. A priori means from beforehand. And so it means without necessarily having any experience. So from before experience. So if something is known a priori, it means we didn't necessarily derive it from experience. So with regard to the mathematical notion of 2 plus 2 equals 4, we didn't derive that from checking it again and again in the world, but rather that's already in us, in the structure of our thinking, and the very structure of mathematics. We didn't say that 2 apples plus 2 apples will always give you 4 apples, but we better check about that with bananas and oranges. No, this is external to experience. It's a mathematical notion that we have external to experience, and so we don't need to check it in the world. We know in any case of 2 pieces of fruit and then 2 more pieces of fruit being put into a bag, we know the consequence will be, if the bag was empty, we know the consequence will be 4 pieces of fruit, whatever they be. We did not learn that from experience. That's mathematics applied to the world. And the mathematical structures and the notion of mathematics is in our minds. Now let's look at the term a posteriori. We've already seen this to mean empirical, or things that happen in the world. So it is not a priori, that is known in the very meaning of the terms. It's not a priori that cigarettes cause cancer. It's rather a posteriori. It's something we learned in our experience of the world. That is, the use of cigarettes does not mean cancer, and cancer doesn't mean the use of cigarettes. But as it happens, if human beings do use cigarettes, their chances of contracting cancer are very greatly increased. So these are two notions that are not identical, but they're connected on the basis of our experience in the world, our experience of human beings smoking in the world. Synthetic. Synthetic is a synthesis. Many of the clothes that you're wearing right now are probably synthetic blends. So it's a synthesis, a putting together of two or more things. And so that synthesis makes a third thing, the kind of material then that you're wearing, or a synthetic blend of material. The term analytic has to do with analysis. And if something is true analytically, it means it's true in virtue of the meanings of the words. For example, all unmarried adult male human beings are bachelors. Now that's true because of the meaning of the words, because unmarried adult male human being means bachelor. So that's analytically true. Something that's synthetically true is the association learned a posteriori between cigarettes and cancer. The two of them are brought together, and they're based on the experience of the world, a posteriori. Now you recall, though, that Kant wants to insist that these notions of morality are in us a priori. That is, the notion of respecting all rational beings is part of our very nature as ourselves rational beings. So Kant would say this is in us a priori. We did not learn this notion of respect that's manifested in the categorical imperative. We did not learn this from looking around in the world as to how people acted. Rather, we know that respect must be shown to human beings even if we do not see it happen in the world. So the categorical imperative then is called a synthetic a priori practical proposition. Let's unpack this. It is a proposition or a statement, such as all rational beings must be respected. It is a synthetic because it's putting together two different things. So one of them is respect and the other is rational being. The very meaning of the term rational being is not respect, nor is respect the very meaning of rational being. So the two are not identical, but rather there's a synthesis or a putting together of this in our minds, a priori, according to Kant, because we are rational beings. And so, and this proposition has to do with regard to action, hence it's practical. So the categorical imperative, the imperative that says that you must show respect for every rational being, yourself and others, and the other forms that it has, that is a proposition. It is practical because it says how we should act. It is a priori because it's not derived from the way the human beings act in the world, and it's synthetic because it's a putting together of two distinct notions. So, of course, as I've said before in our classes, then there should be 0 sexual assaults on the Marquette campus. But in the real world, there are some sexual assaults on Marquette's campus. So the notion, though, that there should be none is a moral notion, and it is, as it were, otherworldly. That is, it demands morality of this world, which is imperfect. And when we act as moral beings, we bring that notion of morality, in a sense, from another world and from another realm. That is, from a realm that is not the same as we see it in our experience in the world. So notice this. People who insist upon morality and insist that all human beings be respected are insisting on something that is absolute and is coming from elsewhere because, in fact, it is not learned just from our world, because in our world, all human beings are not respected. It's very common for people not to respect other human beings. So morality is not this worldly. Morality is brought by the rational being, that is human beings, brought by the rational being into the world. And here we insist that morality be followed. Even if it's imperfectly followed, we still say that it is right that morality be followed in all of these cases. So again, this is about 25% of what you need to know in this course. What is the categorical imperative? It is a synthesis, a putting together of two ideas, so it's synthetic. It is a priori. It is not learned from the world. It is not a posteriori. It is practical. It's a guide to action. And it's a proposition. It's a statement. So the notion that all rational beings must be respected is a duty for us that is expressed in a synthetic a priori practical proposition. Now, reason in this case then, reason dictates what ought to happen independent of experience as a moral a priori condition of moral virtue or excellence. So it's there, it's already being dictated by us. That people don't regard it this way, that people don't pay attention to it, that people fail and take bribes or seek out pleasures or seek dominance in other ways that violate what reason says is not surprising. But reason is supposed to be, as you know from earlier, is supposed to be a guide for us in constructing the good will. And if we construct the good will, we will never intentionally do anything morally wrong. So, reason's dictating as reason here, not merely as human reason, means that the moral law holds for all reasoning or rational beings, human or otherwise. Notice this is quite important. Kant is claiming that all rational beings hold for the categorical imperative. That is, respect must be shown for all rational beings. And if it turns out that aliens arrive on our planet and they are rational, then Kant would say this is also to be found in them. So it isn't happening in us just because we're human, it's happening because we are rational and we use reason. So according to Kant, all rational beings must abide by a priori moral laws. It's the duty and obligation of a human being to respect all other rational beings, and so all rational beings must abide by this a priori moral law. Now, is there a proof of the existence of moral laws or standards that are a priori? Well, Kant tells us, consider the life of the Holy One. And here he's referring to Jesus, or one could even say the life of Muhammad, for example, although it's not discussed here, and Kant doesn't know enough about Islam regarding that. So the standard is there, and the life of Jesus is recognized as a holy life. So each event thought to be illustrative of the moral good is compared to an original a priori concept of moral perfection before it's deemed to be a perfect illustration. Now I said illustrative of it. And I said a perfect illustration, because we use our reasoning to choose those parts of Scripture which contain moral laws. It is not the case that human beings blindly, Christians blindly, follow Jesus and do just whatever Jesus did. We have one report of Jesus bending down and drawing in the sand. Would it mean then that this is a holy action, and we too then should bend, those of us who are Christians should bend down in the sand on Sundays and draw in the sand? We don't know exactly what that was. But the point is this: the good things that Jesus has done and the things that he insists upon as essential to our human existence, these are illustrations of something that is already in us. The notion of respect, which is a synthetic a priori practical proposition when expressed as the categorical imperative. That is to say, the morality is in us. If it were not in us, we couldn't pick out the good moral passages of Scripture, as opposed to the ones that are not necessarily relevant at all to morality. We would take it all and imitate in every way, but that's silly. So what Kant is insisting upon is that he has not created this notion of the a priori and of the categorical imperative, but rather it's already there, it's been there all along for us, and he has discovered it in the sense of uncovered it and made it open to the light so we can see it. Hence, according to Kant, as I've been hinting all along here, there's a complete separation of the world and morality. They are not the same. The world contains actions of human beings, and they are a posteriori, or empirical matters. But the other world of morality is different. It's a priori, and it puts absolute demands on us if we are to be moral. But wait, that last part of the statement is wrong. Not if we are to be moral, because we are required to be moral. So, number one, we are required to be moral persons insofar as we are rational. And secondly, we are required to act in accordance with the imperative or the commands of duty, which is found in the categorical imperative. That is, we are required by our very rationality to be respectful of other rational beings. Now, Kant had called this the metaphysics of morals. So in this sense, the metaphysics of morals is completely separate from anthropology, theology, physics, and other sciences. And this is required for the purity of duty with respect to the moral law. That is, the notions of the metaphysics of morals, the obligation, the duties we have, and the absoluteness of the categorical imperative, these are in us already. They're already in the structures of our very being as rational. That's Kant's contention. What about will in relation to moral law and rational beings? Well, as I said earlier, will is not just whim, but rather practical reason. And by whim, I mean just whatever you feel like doing. It's not that, but it's practical reason. So we have to use our reason out of respect for other rational beings, as I said earlier. So now we look at it this way. Reason works to determine the will. If reason does so without making any mistakes, then what reason presents to us is what is objectively necessary and presents it to us as subjectively necessary. Let me explain this. So reason figures out what's going on in the situation and figures out what our moral duty is and how it is we will show respect to ourselves and others in a particular situation. Reason tells us we are to do such and such an action because it is part of our duty to show respect. But on the other hand, we're free to do whatever we please on a subjective level. So while objectively, reason tells us what the right thing to do is, we can still disregard that. Pardon me. We can choose money, pleasures, power, many other things. And human beings often do this. But what we have to do is work with our reason and our goodwill so that whatever reason tells us is the right thing to do, we also individually, on a subjective level, make it necessary for ourselves. That is, we compel ourselves to do what is morally right, even if we have the option to do what is morally wrong. As practical reason, then, will is, quote, a faculty of choosing only that which reason, independently of inclination, recognizes as being practically necessary. That is, as good. Close quote. So that's what will is. It's the ability to choose what reason presents to us as good and right. And we choose it because we've determined that it is necessary for us to do so. And we do that because we are acting in accordance with, with the goodwill. That's what a moral person does. The law to be followed here, then, is what rational beings have the power to act in accord with. Rational beings are able to create their own characters and be themselves. And they are free to make this. They are free to create themselves as moral characters and free to create within themselves the goodwill. Other beings don't have this power and can't be rational, like lions and tigers and bears. When does immorality occur? Immorality occurs when the will, on an individual and subjective basis, submits to conditions and incentives not presented by reason as objective conditions. That is, the will does not act in accord with reason. And when the will decides to ignore reason, then the will does something that is contrary to its obligation to act in accordance with the good will. So, this is what it means, and I'll explain this. Objectively necessitated conditions are subjectively contingent. What reason presents to us in an objective way as what we must do, as necessitated conditions, what we should do, these are still subjectively contingent. It's still up to us to decide whether to go in accord with our will. And we are able to set aside what reason tells us is the right thing to do because we're weak and we can fail and we want power and pleasure and money and all kinds of other things. But our moral obligation is to let reason rule for us and helping us to form the good will so that whatever reason tells us is necessary for morality, we make it necessary for ourselves, and we choose to do it. So this is the case even if objectively necessitated conditions, what reason presents to us, are subjectively contingent. That is, are up to us to decide about following on an individual basis. As Kant puts it then, quote, that is to say that the relation of the objective laws, and those are the laws that are of moral duty, to a will not thoroughly good, is represented as the determination of the will of a rational being by principles of reason which the will does not follow because of its own nature. The will does not follow because of its own nature. So when we refuse to follow objective laws and refuse to do what is thoroughly good, then we're following something out of our own nature. We're following something else that we choose to because of our wants, needs, desires, or whatever. But we're choosing to do it, and we're responsible for the choices that we make. So the objective principle represented to the will as necessitating or making it do something is a command of reason. It came from reason. And the formula of the command from reason is an imperative. So the categorical imperative is a no exceptions command. Act only on that maxim which you can at the same will to be a universal law. That is the universality principle. Make it a universal rule. And if you can make that rule apply universally, then you have permission to proceed with it. That's also the notion of respect from the categorical imperative, just in a different form. Now, what about imperatives? Kant lists several kinds of imperatives. He talks about moral imperatives. He talks about hypothetical imperatives, categorical imperatives. So moral imperatives will be commands relating to moral matters, and hypothetical imperatives are commands that have the term if in it. If you want to drive the car to Madison today, you must put gasoline in the car. That's fine. That's an imperative. It's an absolute command because the car won't make it there without the gasoline. But the if is what's there. In the case of the categorical imperative, that's different because it's categorical, which means there's no exceptions. So it's an imperative, a command that has no exceptions whatsoever. So Kant says at 420, the categorical imperative alone purports to be a practical law, that is, a law ready for action, while all the others may be called principles of the will but not laws. That is, all the others have a hypothetical aspect to them, and they're options, as it were, put to us. Where the categorical imperative does not put an option, but commands that one act without exception with respect to human beings. Hence, according to Kant, then, the categorical imperative is, as I said earlier, a synthetic a priori practical proposition. It's a putting together, before experience, a statement or a connection between respect and rational being that guides us in our practice. In this sense, then, according to Kant at 428, persons are rational beings as ends in themselves. Human beings are absolute values. There is nothing more valuable than a human being, because they are rational beings. And of course, you remember seeing this in the four forms of the categorical imperative that we saw in the first section of Kant. So here we are with this notion then of Kant as a result of this, with the notion the supreme limiting condition of every man's freedom of action is the categorical imperative. That is, it limits what we can do. We're free to do whatever we want so long as it doesn't go against the categorical imperative. But that's a powerful, powerful limitation because the categorical imperative requires us to show respect for ourselves and for others. So you can do whatever you want so long as you do not show disrespect for yourself or other human beings. And this is at the marginal page number 431. So that's what it means, though. It means that it limits our action. You want to steal something from someone. That defies the rule of respect. It's against the rule of respect, the categorical imperative, you would be acting contrary to what is respectful to yourself and contrary to what is respectful to another human being. So that's a limitation put on our freedom of action. Morality limits us. It does not allow us to do whatever we want. We have to be limited in that to doing what shows respect and shows the absolute value of human beings. In this context, then, Kant brings up another notion, completely different in a sense, of the kingdom of ends. Imagine a kingdom or a country where everyone is treated as an end. That is an absolute value. No one is ever used, but everyone is treated fairly and respectfully. That's an ideal. That's a utopian conception of morality. A wonderful place where everyone is treated with absolute respect. And he says that this is grounded in the notion of autonomy. So autonomy is the ground of the dignity of human nature and of every rational nature. What does he mean by autonomy? Auto means self, and nomos means law. So autonomy is self-law. In the morality that I've set out here with regard to Kant, our morality comes from our very selves as rational beings. So we are to act in an autonomous way. That is, we are self-moving beings, and the morality is not imposed from outside. It's already in us, in our very nature as rational. Heteronomy, heteros means other, and nomos means law. Heteronomy is when you let something outside your true and real self as a moral being, something outside, control your actions. Maybe it's wanting for money or power or pleasure or sex or whatever else. Then you let something else become your law. You are no longer in full control. You are not living up to your real self. You are not respecting yourself. To respect yourself in the fullest way, you are to be autonomous, where the morality is already in you as a rational being. Heteronomy is when we fail to show respect for ourselves and we make something else the law of our action, the law guiding our action. That I want that powerful car, so I'll steal it. Heteronomy is I'm letting heteronomy control my actions. Heteronomy controls my will in that sense. When properly speaking, autonomy should control my will. I should be in full control of my will, not the car. The beautiful car controls me in a sense when I say heteronomy. I give myself over to wanting something that is not mine. And that's the end of the second section of Kant on the grounding of metaphysics of morals. And the third section is the final section, and it's pretty complex. So I'll stop here. This will be what we look at, we consider at class on Thursday of this week, and I'll just stop here.